here. We'll leave it alone for now. So this is kind of a map of attacks that are going on right now. And this particular map shows attacks which are being picked up by this one company called Norse. And this company sort of has these like monitoring services out there on their customer systems, and they kind of correlate all the different attacks that those things get hit with, and they show us a nice map of sort of what is happening globally as far as attacks go. And this is a very small portion of the actual attacks. This is just what their network is detecting. This isn't all global attack activity for the whole entire world at once that's comprehensive or anything. So you can see that there's a lot of activity in this area. It's happening globally. It's inside of the U.S. It's outside of the U.S. Sometimes big things come across, and huge denial of service events occur, and big stuff happens on this map. But for the most part, we can kind of just get an idea that there is a lot of action happening in attacks that are prevalent right now. So talking about like what that means and what that means to a business, what that means sort of to a small business especially, is the purpose of this presentation. Now, what I have found is that there is a lot of lack of knowledge and understanding of certain things that relate to cybersecurity. Imagine that. A few years ago, we didn't hear this word constantly being used, and we didn't hear it in the news every day. 10 years back, the word cybersecurity would hardly be mentioned anywhere at any given point in time. You wouldn't really hear it. You might hear some network security stuff or whatever, but like as it being a major issue that has kind of cropped up and is affecting people heavily, we got to ask what is going on. So I just want to kind of cover that and talk a little bit about it. Now, there's a company by the name of Lloyd's. And Lloyd's is a insurance company. I believe they're out of Britain. And Lloyd's has been, they said something interesting. They project that the global cost of cybersecurity related incidents by the year 2019 will reach $2 trillion. Now, $2 trillion is a lot of money. And I think that is an important number because it's quadruple what the number is today, essentially. So if we kind of look at what the cost or what the insurance premiums per $1 billion that Lloyd's is selling right now, in 2013 there really wasn't any kind of cybersecurity insurance premiums that were being heavily sold. In 2015 they were about $25 billion that were sold. So there was this huge market that suddenly emerged, but in 2019, they're expecting those premiums to be reaching $100 billion that people are going to be paying for their insurance for cybersecurity. So a quadrupling effect going on there. And if we look at especially this one graph here, we see that the trend over time says that according to Google Trends, in 2012 versus 2016, there has definitely been a quadrupling of interest in that trend in the cybersecurity phrase or word. So there's kind of this correlated quadrupling kind of effect going on with this, and it's sort of it's definitely a spiral. It's definitely on a slope, and it's definitely on the rise. And so what are the threats that we're dealing with today? Now, I deal with threats on a regular basis all the time because the businesses I'm supporting and servicing get attacked, and we see these kinds of threats and we experience them and we have to deal with them. And there are there are all kinds of different reasons and ways that these things are coming at us. So one of the things that's happened in the last few years is smartphones, the adoption of smartphones. Go back to 2007. The iPhone was released 10 years ago. Before that, there was no iPhone. When there was no iPhone, some people had some Blackberries. There was no mobile internet. The mobile internet is pretty new. In 2007, when that iPhone got released, a lot has happened and changed in the industry since then, since that first version, since that early edition there. And it's taken years. 2010, 2012, we start to see around 2012, everybody's got a smartphone. They've either got an Android or an Apple. Everyone's got 2013, 2014. By the time we reach today, the world is pretty much empowered with smartphones. So we have all of these little devices now, and each of these things are like little computers. So how many new computers have come to the scene since over the last 10 years? The number of computers that we've added to the system, to the network, to the internet, that number has spiked and increased dramatically. So that has created an adoption rate that's been very high, and it's changed the way that security is has been addressed. Now, Apple did a really good job kind of like trying to get ahead of the trend there and know that there's going to be some things they had to do to change some ways that things were working, but that kind of held them back in some ways too, because it made it more difficult for people to put stuff on their platform, even though it made their platform work better, and we call it kind of the walled garden. Now, another thing that we run into is that smartphones sometimes carry parasites, and many times people bring their smartphones into your corporate network, and they join onto your Wi-Fi, and they get onto the network, and maybe they might have they might be able to basically like touch other devices on the network. And if that phone or whatever comes on the network and it has a parasite, it's very likely, it's possible that an attacker could pivot off of that phone and either pivot into other devices on the network or use that network as a attack to send out this kind of denial of service or some other kind of attack request or something that is malicious and is for evil. So that can have an impact in many things. It can have an impact on your internet bandwidth suddenly. Somebody brings in their smartphone and it's got a parasite. Maybe it's an employee and they're there every day with it, and suddenly the internet's going to junk. No one knows why. So that's one reason. The cloud adoption. The adoption of the cloud is a big deal, because the cloud has enabled us to build these really sophisticated, great systems, and they're amazing and they're great and we love them, and we can scale these things to the moon, and we can bring them right back down to the size of a flea. I mean, we can just do things we could never do before. We don't have to worry about investing in. We have to rack up these servers and plan our power and our cooling and all this different stuff, and we can only go forward. We can only go up. We can't go down. With the cloud, we can go every direction, and we can do anything, and we can do it all instantly, and we don't have to order servers and rack things up and bolt things down, and it's great. We love it. Okay, it's more stable. It's more powerful. It enables people to deliver applications rapidly for less cost than ever before, with less major investment, only investing a few pennies or investing basically dollars when you used to have to invest tens of thousands of dollars just to kind of get started. So it's taken the entry barrier way down. What that's done is that has enabled poorly configured systems running on powerful servers. Now that is interesting, because the attackers scan the internet, and we know, maybe you've heard of these things of WordPress. WordPress is a common example. It's running a lot of websites on the internet now, and WordPress it actually essentially it runs this system that tends to have a lot of vulnerabilities, and it's very widely propagated, and not everybody is keeping their updates done on their web server or their website, or maybe they kind of they ordered a little website and they threw it on a little cloud server and it's running and they're happy, or maybe they just forgot about it. Whatever. Attackers scan for these things. They find these systems that have vulnerabilities because people haven't invested in keeping them up to date. And it's like this. If I was to go out and I was to decide that I wanted to buy let's say a fishing yacht, okay, and I get it and it's great and it can go out and it can fish offshore and it can do wonderful things and it's amazing, and then I find out though the cost of running that vessel are significantly higher than what my ability to keep up with that is. So I might find myself in a situation where I own a fishing yacht. I cannot afford to put fuel in, nor do I really want to use it lest I fear it break, and it just rots at that point. Okay, so that's a very bad situation, and it's very similar to the situation that a lot of websites are in, where these sites are present and they've been built, and originally when they were built they were in good condition, but over time that condition kind of erodes, and the cost and investment to kind of mitigate that and kind of keep that up to date, for many people it's confusing and they don't understand it, or they're just not aware. So a lot of times an attacker will hit that site and embed themselves into it, and they'll get access to that cloud server, and now they have a powerful system that's poorly configured they can use for evil. So from that, they can launch a number of attacks. They can use it as a staging server. They can use it to attack other systems. They can perform denial of service. So that's a pretty significant problem. And I think that we have a responsibility as a community to focus on providing that level of support into the cloud, and to keep those guys out of it. And unfortunately that requires some education and some budgeting. So another element that is a big threat we're seeing is I don't want to say this is a threat, but this causes a threat. Okay, it contributes to a condition, and that is, I would say, is free software. So the open source software, free software, there's a lot of this going on. I love it. I definitely am a number one backer of the open source community and Linux and everything that it's all about, and I totally am on board with it, and I love it, and it's important. But when you can erect a system in the cloud and install a powerful application on it that you don't have to pay any money for, there's a great temptation to just set it up and let it run and hope that it can bring an ROI in, or use the ROI that it gets and not really consider the total cost of ownership to support that free software. So there is no such thing as free, guys. Yeah, I think the phrase "free as in beer" is kind of applicable, but there is no free. There are people that contribute code to projects that are open source, and we can take these and run them, and we don't have to pay a licensing fee for the software, and if we can make a contribution to the software, we have to give that contribution to the community, and the community can't take that contribution and resell it and charge for it. That all is true. What is often misunderstood is that free software means free software. Well, in fact, it means that the development of that is driven by the community, and typically there's a layer where you want to buy support for that software. People will avoid that in many cases and not pay for the additional support that they may or may not need on that application. Now, buying support and contributing financially to these development initiatives in the open source community, I think, is super critical, and I believe that is what builds good software or companies that can put better stuff out And if the mentality of the business already is to give the software away, but to get paid for the support, then that is more of an open source mentality than to sell a license for the software. Because many times organizations like Microsoft in the past have sold a license to the software but not included any actual tech support. So then you have to pay for tech support in addition to buying the license. Well, then you're stuck with this license. You try to run it out as long as you can. Okay, then you end up with an old version that doesn't have the latest patches, and you don't want to upgrade it because it costs too much money and you paid for this thing once and you don't see why you need to buy another one. Okay, well, in fact, the industry is moving to a subscription model because that mentality of buying a license is kind of out the door now, and developers and businesses and everyone understands now, in the industry at least, that for an application to have support and continued development and bug fixes and enhancements, improvements, and everything else, it really needs to have a way to make money. And you can't give away the software for free and not get any money and be able to enhance and improve it. Of course, right? It would just be complete chaos if that's how it works. It doesn't work that way. The laws of physics do apply to this stuff, guys. And so when we implement an open source application, we generally need to be wary of the costs of that in terms of support. And is there support available? Can I buy external support for that? What is the development path of that look like? How am I going to upgrade this? How am I going to get patches? How am I going to get bug fixes? What about enhancements and improvements? And what if I need help? Can I pick up the phone and call? Or do I have to go to a community forum that's driven by only a community and lob a question in there and hope somebody answers it? And maybe if I have been really nice in the community before and contributed some answers in that community before, I might get back some positive responses, or I might get thrown, under the bus. Who knows? Just, we don't know because it's a community forum and it's free support. That is really tricky stuff. And so what happens is these applications get put on these systems. They don't get updated. They don't get patched because the people that are installing them, that are buying the cloud server, and spending the least they can there and throwing the open source software on there, and kind of like the overall support budget is kind of left in the wind, and it's like, let's get this thing up, let's get this thing going, let's get this thing done, let's make this stuff happen, let's have it make money, and then let's worry about, fixing the tail end of it like that. Because in situations that are not heavily capitalized up front, that is a mentality that people get into, and it has created this wide, broad spread, like just this huge spike in vulnerable systems that are out there. The other thing is vulnerable operating systems, right? Say we deploy a Linux server, it's running some older version of Linux. We have to upgrade the distribution. If we do that, it might break things. If it breaks things, we might have to spend money to have developers and infrastructure people figure it out, and so let's just leave it be, right? Vulnerable versions of operating systems can be many times exploited and hacked, and in many cases, in some cases, depending on the version and what vulnerabilities are out there, those can include things like an attacker being able to completely take over the server, or the workstation for that matter. Windows XP is long gone. We all know that. Well, Windows 7 in less than 2 years, in about a year and a half, Windows 7 is going to be out the door, and we're going to have to get rid of all of our Windows 7. So everybody that's using Windows 7 now, who loves Windows 7 and wants to keep on using it, is basically going to have a very hard time with this, and it's going to be a big deal. So I think that upgrading to Windows 10 is real important. Upgrading to Server 2012 from Server 2008, because Server 2008 is also out of date at the same time as 7. And there's a lot of systems that are on this. There's a ton of people that are running Windows 7 computers, especially computers that previously were upgraded to Windows 8, or from Windows XP. So there's a huge gap out there, and there's a great need for investment in that. And I'm seeing a lot of people that still are not on Windows 10. It was interesting when Windows 10 first came out. I thought to myself, when they started forcing the upgrade, I kind of thought to myself, why would Microsoft do that? That's like a major line of revenue for them, and there's a ecosystem of upgrades and sort of a cycle that we've all been in. So like throwing a free upgrade that automatically gets pushed to people seemed kind of not the norm and really, really weird. And it also really affected us IT companies, because normally we would be planning sort of these upgrade cycles and talking about projects to do that kind of upgrade work and sort of have a structured plan for it in place. And then suddenly it's just like, boom, hey, it's done, or it's not. And that leaves us in this lurch. So a lot of people are running 10 on very old hardware, and a lot of people are running 7 on similar hardware. And some people are still buying 7 today instead of 10, out of fear that 10 won't work with their applications. So it's going to be hard for them in a year and a half to go ahead and force over to 10. I think that's something we need to think very heavily about, and people need to be familiar with and aware that and going up and doing upgrades at the end of the deadline for the patches is a bad idea too. So really, like, in the next 6 months, people need to start putting together budgets for doing mass upgrades of Windows 7 to 10. It is what it is. So in a case where an organization has 50, 100 computers and we need to move all of those up to 10, there's significant costs and labor associated with that. So we have to be wary of this. Okay, another one, phishing scams. Now, we have seen a ton of aggressive social attacks, aggressive phishing scams that have a lot of ransomware attached to them. And there is, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I would say that those are the number one way that the attackers are actually getting in the door is through phishing scams. And unfortunately, it's because the users are not really paying attention. They get an email, it says something like, the IRS needs to talk to you, or it says something like your package wasn't, your UPS package wasn't delivered, or something like that, and they click it, they open it, and it contains some malicious code. Now, if they're running a vulnerable operating system, then that malicious code could take effect and really impact them. Or if they just allow the code to execute because they click yes, then there's nothing we can do, right? It's just that code has now been executed. And antivirus many times won't necessarily pick up something every single time. We cannot count on antivirus to be solid in that way. So that is something that I think needs a lot of training, and people need to be aware. They need to be made aware of what the threats are regarding that. Now, I'm going to be doing some phishing training out of here, and I think that people will have an opportunity to get phished by me, and they'll have an opportunity to learn the tactics of phishing so that they can be made fortified against that, so their culpability is decreased. Now, attackers are after some stuff. One thing that they are after is identities, because if they can steal your identity, then they're going to be able to potentially propagate stealing more identities, and they're going to propagate trust better. They're going to be able to propagate their phishing better. If they steal your identity and they use your identity to phish your friends are more likely to be caught by that, just because it could be coming directly from a trusted known source that they are familiar with already. So that's a big deal, and the identity thefts are on the rise, of course, as well. And what people are experiencing with that is completely terrible. We need to protect our identities, and if we lose our identities, then we have a harder time getting credit, and we can have our bank accounts potentially drained. A number of other things can happen. One of the big threats we're seeing right now is ransomware. This is a huge threat, and it's really caused a lot of problems. It's been in the news very heavily lately, and it's been sort of propagated by the rise of Bitcoin. Not necessarily specifically Bitcoin, but that has been the general one that these guys have been using the most of. I'll talk about that in a minute. Another one is the Internet of Things. We have this Internet of Things, which is essentially been growing, and it's growing and growing and growing. And when I talk about the Internet of Things, one thing I'm talking about is stuff like smart refrigerators or smart kind of like any kind of like a smart thermostat, or these things that are on the internet. They're connected to the internet, and they're part of the Internet of Things. Okay. They're popping up everywhere. Amazon Alexas are an example. Okay, these things get attached to the network. They do stuff. People interact with them, but they're still devices. They're still computers. They're still part of the system and part of the network. And the network people are getting. We're having less and less of influence over what goes on our networks. And so, to protect and defend our networks properly is certainly becoming more challenging, and I think that it's going to continue to become a bigger challenge as the Internet of Things continues to grow. Another one is the denial of services. The denial of service is a big deal. It's propagated by the botnets. The botnets might be propagated by those Internet of Things, those smartphones, the cloud, all of that different stuff kind of allows the botnets to kind of propagate and grow. Well, let's get a little more specific. So Bitcoin and ransomware, are an item that I want to discuss here. And this is a 12-month chart that's a little out of date now of Bitcoin. And you can really see that in the last year, Bitcoin has gone up significantly. It is at, I believe, current price of Bitcoin is, I believe, around $2,500. So in the last couple of months, just since I put this slide together, Bitcoin's gone up another $1,000. It just keeps on going up. It's had a meteoric rise. It's been in the news. It's a big deal. And what is it? Well, it's a stable resource. It is there's a finite supply of this stuff out there. It's a decentralized currency, and it can be exchanged securely. Now, one interesting thing about it is that neither party that's doing the exchange has to trust each other, which is kind of interesting, because if I don't trust you and you don't trust me, then how can we make an exchange? And that is because the network validates that both of these people are indeed agreeing to make this exchange. And the purpose of that is to make sure that a exchange of currency between two people does not occur without both of those parties wanting it to. So somebody can't just go in and just snatch a bunch of Bitcoin and pull it into their account is basically the idea. And so it can't really be manipulated. Now, one of the, that's important because that makes it a very stable sort of thing to use. So it's not centralized, it can't be manipulated, it can allow two people that don't trust each other to come to a common agreement on something. It's stable, stable as volatile, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it, and there's a finite supply. So Bitcoin, the analysts that are talking about Bitcoin are talking about how it's set to continue to rise and continue to grow. I've seen people talk about $10,000 Bitcoins in the future. I've heard crazy people saying it could hit $1 million. I don't think so. I think that's just fantasy. But hey, whatever. We don't know. I mean, with the Bitcoin tends to do well when the world tends to become less stable. And as we go into the next few years, a sort of instability and volatility in the future of certain global things may shape up. If it does, then Bitcoin stands to gain a lot out of that. So if for those of us who maybe have a sort of a perspective that the future, it has a lot more volatility in it than we have experienced so far, those of us, we might make that kind of bet on Bitcoin being a good bet. So it's become an investment tool that a lot of people are putting money into and investing into, and there's more than one cryptocurrency out there. That doesn't matter to this conversation, but the point is that since all of these things are true about it, the criminal gangs that propagate ransomware are using it as a means to fund their operations. So let's get back to ransomware for a minute. What is ransomware? It's basically a virus that attacks your computer. It hits it, it encrypts your files, and then it puts a big message on the screen that says, send us a Bitcoin and we'll decrypt your files for you. And that's essentially what ransomware does and is. Many times an attacker will find some vulnerability, some vector. They'll get their ransomware foot in the door there. They'll use some worm to spread the ransomware around the network. And remember, many people build their networks with this concept that they should be hard on the outside but soft on the inside. And they don't think it like that. They just build them like that. So once the attacker is inside the network, which could be from an out-of-date web browser, I'll just give you, for example, a user in an accounting department one day went to a website which had a flash game, a Sudoku game, a little web browser Sudoku game. And this user's sitting there playing Sudoku. And I get an antivirus alert triggered to my desk and go over and look at that computer, and I find that they're on a website, and this website had been compromised, and their web browser was an older version of Internet Explorer, and they were using it because they had some applications that required that version of Internet Explorer. So the users used to using that version of Internet Explorer. It's there for them to use. It's the one installed on their computer because they need it for these other applications, but they've gone to this other website. They're playing a Sudoku game. That website, let's say, is was just kind of a cheaply thrown together website, little free Sudoku things dropped on it, some ads dropped on it, thrown into some cheap hosting, just thrown up on the internet, boom, there it is. That goes back to that kind of bad, kind of poorly configured site that I'm talking about. So that site had been compromised, and the attacker was trying to send a payload through to hit the web browser of the user. The only reason it didn't get through is just because the antivirus detected there was a connection coming from somebody that it didn't expect or want to be there. And that was part of the intrusion detection system of the antivirus at that point. Had that intrusion detection component not been present, the computer certainly would have been compromised because the web browser was vulnerable, and the vulnerability had been activated by the attacker, but the antivirus was able to stop that connection from being made, even though the browser was essentially had been infected. Point is that a user can get infected by doing something they normally do that isn't bad. And that infection can come back onto the network, and because then once inside the network, the attacker can actually look around the network and find more weak spots and other vectors and vulnerabilities to pivot through so that they can try to either move laterally around the network if they're at a low privilege level, or they try to escalate their privilege level. Once these guys kind of figure out what they can get out of that network, they go ahead and hit it with the ransom in some cases. And in those cases where they're well researched and they're hit hard, oh my gosh. Yeah, that's where you get like an entire hospital. Everything is ransomed there, and there's nothing they can do. And it's a Bitcoin for every single computer on the network, and there's 500 computers, and you'd have to spend, $500 million in Bitcoin or something like that just to get out of it. um, generally speaking, most of the time, recovering from ransomware requires restoring from backup, and that alone takes a long time. But if you don't have one, you're really out of luck in that case. There have been some stuff that where some of these certain ransomwares, they figure out how to reverse engineer the encryption algorithm, and then they can decrypt everyone's files that are encrypted by that one version. But that's hit or miss. So ransomware is a big deal. It funds criminal gangs. The criminal gangs make money from it. They make millions of dollars a year in this stuff. What do they do with it? They use it for research and development purposes, and they put their money into R&D so that they can find new vectors of attack and hit people. So the way that ransomware works is the criminal gangs use it. They exploit something. They successfully find a vulnerability, or they do social engineering and they get their foothold. They assess everything in there. They fire that payload and they get their ransom. So some stats, the success. Of course, I believe that successful ransom payments fund them developing that stuff further. They're mostly just using social engineering as a main key way of getting that stuff out there. 93% of phishing emails contained ransomware in 2016, and ransomware attacks were up 6,000% in the 2015 to 2016 years. This has generated over $1 billion in payouts to the bad guys. And this is data that I got before the most recent ransomware attack we experienced, which is the WannaCry attack. And we had that attack because this hacker group called the Shadow Brokers got online. They hacked into the NSA, or somebody hacked into the NSA, stole the NSA's cache of weaponized hacker tools the spies use. And they took those, published them on the internet for everybody. Then those got picked up, and new tools got written around them rather quickly and then deployed. There was a humongous attack that went out globally. People were hit all over the place because of these. It was a near 0-day vulnerability. It was only like 3 months disclosed or something, or patched for 3 months or whatever, which is very, very low amount of time. I mean, it may take 30 days before the patches roll out. It may take another 60 days if there was issues before the patches get really sorted out sometimes and settled in many cases. So it would be very easy for a company to not have current patches that are only 90 days old. That's a major problem. I'll tell you this, I took a cybersecurity course, the OSCP course, this last year, and one thing that we learned was how to write a virus, which is not anything terribly complicated. It's very easy, but the thing we learned that was interesting was how to write a virus that couldn't be detected by antivirus. And they taught us some tactics and techniques in that course that were very scary, and really that I hadn't found and come across in any of the books, the hacker books that I'd read prior, that talk about obscuring antivirus or obscuring a virus from antivirus. But hackers can custom payload out a virus which will pass and will not be detected by antivirus, but there's a fairly fast decay time on those in many cases, and so they have a short window where those will work, and in many cases a custom payload that these guys are writing, they have the money to keep doing it. So that gives them an edge to write viruses that potentially can beat even antivirus software. And I mean, think about it. If you are getting hit with attacks like that, and these guys are sending them all over the world, they're landing some of these attacks. These guys gain their shell. They get a command line directly into the system. They can do things with that at the privilege level of whatever it was they exploited. So if they're exploiting let's say a database service, the database service in many cases runs at the level of the system, and that gives them the full system access. Or there's so many different things that when I set up computers for people, a lot of times they say, hey, I need to be an administrator of my computer. I need to be a local administrator. I need to be able to install a little WebEx thing or a little deal here, install a Notepad thing, or install whatever I want to install without ticketing IT. But then when we give them the admin access, that means that if something they're doing is vulnerable, whether or not it was by any fault of their own or not, an attacker hits that, the attacker can gain the privilege level of that user, which is extremely bad. And I think that, definitely is somewhat of a problem. But what we're seeing with that is when the criminal gangs end up funding these payloads, they're just going to keep coming at us and coming at us and coming at us. Now, I was talking about the end of Windows 7 and Server 2008, and that Windows 7 support ends in January 2020. But what was interesting is that around January of this last year, there was an article in Forbes that a Microsoft executive actually came right out and said that Microsoft warns Windows 7 is dangerous to use. And this was his word. These were his words. This was the quote. And now, the thing that struck me about that was Microsoft has gone out of their way to get people off of 7. There must be something terrible in 7 that Microsoft doesn't want people to be impacted by. Maybe it already is what WannaCry was all about. I don't know, but something was really bad, and Microsoft was aware of it. So they basically, this executive made this statement. Well, Microsoft, Microsoft removed that article and moved it to this German blog instead, and it's kind of weird, but I would definitely listen to that executive and know that Microsoft is not kidding around. There is a big problem with Windows 7, and we need to get rid of it. Vista support is already gone, so if you're running Windows Vista, then you might as well be running Windows XP. Actually, you'd probably be better off on XP. So the power and danger of the cloud we've talked about a little bit earlier, but remember, the cloud scales to meet any need. So anything that we need to do, we can do with the cloud and scale up and down that way. We can incrementally buy it. We can buy our storage and our computing power, our memory, everything incrementally. We can get enterprise grade hosting on this stuff. It's huge because we have these conditions and these situations where we build our servers in the broom closets too often, and we build our data centers out of the broom closet, is what I say. And I've been saying this for like 15 years, and it's driven me nuts. And now we have the cloud, and we can access it, and we can get stuff at enterprise grade, no problem at all. So accessibility has led to huge growth in the cloud, like I talked about earlier, and the competitive advantage is going to go to the innovators. So if you're not using the cloud, then you might get outflanked by your competition, and you could have a competitive advantage by using the cloud. So some of the disadvantages I might have touched on some of these a little earlier. Cheap innovation has created security gaps, because if it's cheap to get in, then the thought process of what's the actual total cost on this, or if you looked at the total cost on it, you would just back off of it in many cases. Exploitable sites, they become the malicious attack points that the hackers use, from botnets to various kinds of brute force attacks, spam attacks, all kinds of malicious stuff. They the attackers are using these resources, and we or you are paying for these resources. So when I have a system, if it gets taken over by a hacker and that hacker uses a lot of resources I wasn't expecting, there could be costs associated with that I wasn't expecting as well, and that is always a danger. Now, smartphones and the Internet of Things, of course, being another one of the issues to talk about. We have this huge explosion in these consumer devices. All this technology has been created around them. How much testing has been really thoroughly done around all that? Not nearly enough to really mitigate the threat and the problem. Like I talked about earlier, Wi-Fi connected smartphones can carry parasites. We run into this all the time, and I like solutions like Cisco Meraki, for example, that tries to combat that. The Internet of Things is making it, it's making new points of vulnerabilities present that we are less likely to be able to rapidly identify and determine if there's a threat. IP cameras, Amazon Alexas. I mean, I've brought up Amazon Alexa a couple times, and there's no known threat to having an Amazon Alexa that I'm aware of today, but it's just an Internet of Things type device. It's a really great example of that kind of device. So, and now we had some Chinese IP cameras that had a vulnerability in them, and this vulnerability showed up, and it made these cameras into botnets that were used to do massive attacks. So think about this. You may install some little Internet of Thing device around. That device might become compromised. If it does, then you might contribute a little bit to a huge attack. And it comes back down to like that map of attacks I was talking about earlier that I started with, which if everybody focused all of their energy attacking one thing, then that one thing will suffer. So when you get a large enough amount of bandwidth directed at one place, then that resource won't be available online. If that resource is a public company that was about to disclose a major product or do something interesting, or there was a large event that just suddenly just gets blacked out, or I mean, think about it. Like if you were, let's say that there's a Russian criminal gang out there, and they hack or a Chinese criminal gang, or any African criminal gang, doesn't matter, wherever they are, United States criminal gang, doesn't matter. They breach all these systems, they get all this power, and then if they decide that they want, for geopolitical or for any kind of corporate espionage purposes, whatever reason it may be, potentially that network, that botnet, might be for rent by hackers. So there's nothing to say that a criminal gang might not rent a botnet anonymously to, let's say, a foreign power that uses it to influence news that related to some geopolitical situation. I'm not saying that's going to happen or has happened, but I am certainly suggesting that is certainly a very big threat, and we're going to see more of that kind of stuff. And you want to talk about censorship? Well, when a foreign power can censor something because they have a network of vulnerable, a giant botnet of vulnerable devices inside of the country they want to censor something on, think about the strategic ramifications there. So, I've talked a lot about the threat and what the problems are, what issues are out there, but what can we do to address this stuff? What's the good news? A lot of bad news, a lot of scary stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the good. So some stuff we can do now that will really cause the bad guys to have issues are going to be multi-factor authentication. And we need to turn on multi-factor authentication everywhere we can. This is very important. And there's there's 3 or 4 things we can do there. For one, we can, multi-factor authentication, first off, is actually that thing where you get a second type of authentication code that's unique before you can access a resource. So maybe you have a bank account and you log in with your password, and then it texts your phone like a little code, and you have to enter that before you can log in or something. There's authenticator apps as well, which have an app on your phone, let's say, that's enrolled to a certain service, and it gives a little code that only lasts like 30 seconds or something like that. So you take that code and you enter it. After you enter your password, it prompts you for the code. Multi-factor is important because this stops the attackers from just being able to take your password and log in. It eliminates the whole entire vector of what are called brute force attacks in most cases. They would have to have access to multiple devices to get into your stuff. There's a couple of major places where I really want to see people putting this to play. Their email, because if someone gets control of your email, then they can do things like password resets on all of your accounts. So your email needs to have multi-factor authentication on it. Office 365 has got this built in. It's a great product. I'll talk about it on another stream. Another one is the LastPass system. I really like LastPass. Some people don't. I do. I really like it. The reason I like LastPass is because with LastPass, I can have unique passwords for every single website and every single system that I use, and I can have those unique passwords rotate all the time and never have to worry about knowing what any of them are. And LastPass takes care of everything for me. So it does so, and it allows me to have multi-factor authentication to get to it as well. So that means that LastPass is very, very secure from that standpoint, from the standpoint of it can allow me to have much better security practices across the board. It also can allow me to have much better flexibility and the ability to share accounts with other people without giving them that password. So I probably should do a whole entire training on LastPass, a whole entire thing on it, but it's a great system and it's pretty much free. I mean, they have a primo version, but I've never really come across a need for it. So I think that people need to test their businesses' users for the culpability of being phished. I think that we need to go out and we need to see if we can train our users better, and if we can teach them so that they don't get phished. I think that would reduce a lot of things, a lot of the vectors of attack if people were better educated. The problem is that education costs, and there's costs associated with it, and it's kind of a speculative thing about, do I need this? Are they going to come up with something next year? Am I going to have to just keep on doing this? I think the answer is yes. We should just plan to have like security conversations, kind of like we have now in businesses all the time, where we have OSHA, where we have our OSHA reviews, and we have certain things that happen that teach us to not stand on chairs with rolling wheels, and to there's things we know to do because we're taught this. We can't just be left to our own devices on it, okay? So we also need to make sure that upgrades are being done that Windows 7 is that there's a plan to get rid of it, and that plan is written and budgeted for. So if you plan for it now and you budget for it now, then one would hope that would be achievable. If you just hear about this in a year from now and somebody says, yeah, in 6 months you got to have Windows 7 gone, you go, what? I got 100 computers I need to replace or upgrade, okay? Now this is very interesting. Some people may not know what PCI Compliance is, and PCI Compliance, I think, is kind of it's the baseline standard that applies to businesses' network security by federal regulations. So PCI Compliance is a federal regulation. It has specific requirements, and generally the people who have to meet it are doing things like processing credit cards on a system that's in their business. So many times restaurants have had like a little point of sale server back there, and when people run credit cards, that server is storing them, and then that server has a broker account that it cashes out those credit card transactions with the bank. Okay, so it does a transfer from there. Now, there's other systems that communicate securely directly with the bank, and those might not need to be PCI compliant because there's already just a secure channel to the bank, and the bank is handling the actual merchant account processing of the whole thing. But in cases where the credit cards are actually stored temporarily on the local server somewhere in the organization, those organizations have to be PCI compliant. So the bank will be doing the transaction to that system. And the bank will usually send these people a letter and say, hey, the way that we're doing this transaction for your merchant account falls under regulations that are federal and called PCI Compliance. So you need to have a vulnerability scan performed on the perimeter, generally a vulnerability scan performed on the interior, and then you need to make sure there's no squawks, that there's no known vulnerabilities that are exposed. You can't have certain things like exposed to the internet that also contain, that are connected to these credit cards and stuff like that. There's certain like proxies of transiting of info, so that it makes it much more difficult for an attacker to pivot in and steal that data. Now, I am postulating now that that is the baseline that everybody really needs to meet, and that if you're not PCI compliant, then you're probably you probably need to get there, and I'm encouraging people to get there. So I'm helping people with that and doing vulnerability scans. I don't certify PCI compliance, but I have worked on so many PCI compliant situations that I can get it to where the network will pass the certification, or can mitigate the required stuff that needs to happen to get the certification. Whether or not it's certified or not, if it doesn't need to be, doesn't matter, as long as the thought process of, have we gone through this step of looking at this and thinking like this, as long as that's been done. Another thing that I'm recommending people do are deploying active sensors in their networks, actively scanning and looking for vulnerabilities, because one day there won't be a vulnerability, the next day there will. And that causes that causes some issues if they're not actively scanning. If I bring a machine over and sit down and plug into a network and scan it and process that and figure that out and spend a day doing that, then the cost for that is significantly more than if I could just plug a drop box in like a Pony Express. Even though those boxes might cost $1,000 to $1,000 plus per box, it still saves a significant amount of money over me manually going out and doing those kinds of tests. So there's other things like segregating the networks with VLANs and not letting your camera network and your phone network and your computer network and everything all on the same wire, and kind of like blocking the traffic from transiting by that way. But I think the number one most important thing that people can do right now for this is to budget appropriately for cybersecurity. Set aside money for this. Don't just think that this is just something that's it's another added expense. I guess I'll just deal with it when I have to. Put aside a budget for that. Put aside a budget that is going to allow you to perform the upgrades, to perform the updates, to perform the scans, to get PCI compliant. Your budget probably needs to increase for your IT spending, unfortunately, is what it means. And I'm not just coming up with this, guys. Let's go back to those graphs that, at the beginning, where we're seeing these quadrupling effects and these costs and all of this stuff. Think about what that means to the IT people. We are fighting this battle, and we're getting our butts kicked sometimes because there's the resources we need aren't there. I mean, if we had the resources, we could do whatever, right? But when things take this sort of spike, the businesses have to react by adjusting their trajectories too, and that's not easy. So, let me tell you about a time that I saw a server get ransomed, and a situation where a hacker was able to get through just because of some of these conditions that I've talked about. There was a situation with a server where this server became compromised, and we discovered that the server was compromised when some activity got detected on it that we thought was strange, and we looked at it and we realized very quickly that there was something very strange going on. We discovered that an attacker had an administrator account that they had created on a domain controller, and this was really remarkable because we weren't really sure how that happened. And when the first thought, was maybe the admin system had a weak password or something, or maybe maybe this was just some like random brute force or something like that the attacker got in from. There was an open port to a terminal server, so there was a port was open there that an attacker could log right into a server through, and that's what the attacker had done. And they had logged into the server, and they had created multiple accounts, and they had logged in all these accounts, and they had stuff going on with all these accounts. And so our performance graphs were like one of the indicators, but the fact that there were these weird users on the system, was another indicator. So we tracked it back down, and ultimately it came down to a user had been infected by a virus a couple of weeks prior. And right after that, their main server had been ransomed. And we had restored it from backup and thought and done virus scans and thought, okay, typical attacker has been, eliminated, and we should be okay. But what we did not know was that there was user accounts that this attacker had created. They were able to log right back into the server. Well, the second time that they got in after ransoming us, they didn't ransom us again right away. What they did is they started setting up a bunch of things to have resources that were illegal resources that they were serving to the internet. And so they were storing a lot of files on our stuff, and they were attacking a number of systems. And when we we shut off all of these levels of remote access to them, and we got rid of them. But what amazed us was, how did they get in that far? If it had just been a low privilege attack, how did they get all the way to the domain admin? We discovered that the first account on the server that had been created that was an administrator account was named Xerox from these guys. And I thought, that's strange. And so a few days later, the printer vendor for this company called me and said, hey, we can't get our scans to go through the printer anymore. And I went over and I told him, I said, well, how did the scans come in? This vendor says they come in via FTP server, transit copy. It sends the files into the server. And I went and I looked and I said, you know what? I had turned off an FTP server that was just running inside the network internally. I didn't know why it was on. And so, the guy says, well, can we turn that back on? Well, okay, let's look at that. We looked at it, and we found that system was running with the domain administrator account as the user that the printer was authenticating. Well, the printer essentially had no security on it. An attacker could easily log into the printer interface or just sniff the wire with a simple, with like Wireshark, and pick the admin account credential right off of the network in plain text, unencrypted, because of this FTP, not secure, not SFTP, but standard, normal, insecure, like it always is, FTP, that transmits a username and text in plain text and a password in plain text. So if you're on the same network and you just sniff the wire and somebody just runs a scan through the printer, you sniff that, you get the packet capture, you can literally get the admin password right off of it, which is essentially what it appeared that they had done. So of course, we changed the printer to not be authenticating with the admin credential. How did that get to be set up? You can only imagine, this is a far remote site, middle of nowhere. And at one point, the server had been set up, and at one point this printer vendor had come in, and the vendor had just asked the owner, hey, I need to get your printer set up so I can scan. I need to log into your server. So the password, the credential was given over to the vendor. The vendor used it to set the system up and left, and the system worked fine for like 5-6 years, something like that, before this problem came about. So I just want to, reiterate that a seemingly innocent thing that does not think about security inside the network, not outside, but inside the network, can create a bigger problem when an attacker is able to pivot through it. So, that's a situation where an attacker was able to get control of a server they shouldn't have been able to get control of, and it came down to just these something that many people do every day and is considered to be a very normal thing, especially 5-6 years ago. So, I have covered all this material, and it's very important stuff. I think that we need to be ready for more attacks. We need to be ready for more aggressive new kinds of hacks, and we just need to be we need to kind of be focusing on increasing our security, increasing our awareness, and staying up to date on our software and with our patches. So, I hope you found this material interesting and useful. Thanks for listening and watching, and that is the end of the stream for today.